So what we were getting at is that, say the new platform mRNA vaccines have some kind of serious side effect,
Sure.
say that rate is 1 in 30,000. There's going to be ongoing discussions going forward about whether or not these vaccines are safe, and so the danger is that there, some person somewhere is going to get, a serious side effect, hypersensitivity, whatever it is, right? Glow in the dark, whatever that is. And then, that's going to be amplified on social media so that the bias will be that, oh, this is causing autism, right? Left and right. Yeah. Adults are now having autism, right? That's going to be the whatever new narrative that is. And I'm not saying, and I know you're not saying that we are saying the vaccine is safe. We're saying that we don't know.
Yeah, but more importantly, actually, and that's a great. I love that statement. Right, is we want to say the vaccine is safe. The problem is, how do you define safe?
Right.
And there's actually important work that's been done. One of my favorite charts is called the Paling Risk Perspective, and it actually is a logarithmic chart of how frequently certain things happen. And what's most interesting about it is that human beings actually have a measurable comfort zone, right? So, the likelihood of like shark attack, right? Very rare, right? The likelihood of dying if you ride a motorcycle exclusively in LA for a year, right? Is like 1 in 1,000, right? And it is right around the 1,000 mark where we start to consider things risky. And we have an intuition on that. Is the things where your mom says, you probably shouldn't do that, skydiving or base jumping, or those are things that will have a injury or death rate around the 1 in 1,000 mark, somewhere between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. After 1 in 10,000, we start to become more comfortable. And after about 1 in 100,000, we actually become relatively comfortable, right? And the thing that gets skewed and where social media comes in is our opinion of how often things happen comes from how often we hear about it. And that goes back to a time when we were tribal, where you had to hear directly from somebody. And that's often and that's like the same thing that's happening with coronavirus is many people are like, well, I don't know anybody that has it, right? And so it can't be that bad. That's exactly that same process at work is that, well, it can't be happening that much because I don't know anybody that has it. And until I do, then I'm not going to assume that the subconscious process that we all have of how risky something is. And then when you do know someone and someone dies of it, all of a sudden your perspective changes.
Yeah.
Right? Because now you know, and all of a sudden your risk estimate gets upgraded based on this subconscious sort of cultural process we all have going on. And social media skews that, right? One of my favorite studies is, what kills more people, homicide or diabetes, right? Most people say diabetes. That's correct, right? What kills more people, diabetes or gastrointestinal cancer? And again, it's diabetes, right? By quite a margin. Which kills more people, homicide or gastrointestinal cancer, right? Most people at that point say homicide, right? Because GI cancer doesn't get that much attention, right? But in fact, it's GI cancer by not an insignificant margin. But because our sense of frequency is skewed by how often homicide is reported and diabetes is reported and how seldom gastric cancer is reported in the media, right? Because of that, we have a false perception of the frequency rate, right? And the same thing happens with coronavirus, same thing happens with vaccines. And in the social media bubbles that are created, you're going to hear more and more about, well, I had got the vaccine and I got this symptom.
Yeah, right.
Right? That could be a 1 in a million symptom, but if it's blown up enough, you're going to hear...
Dr. Oz will drag that kid over to his TV show.
That's right.
Before you know it, there'll be a Facebook group.
Or, and even more so, is like that could be chance. That may not be associated with the vaccine. Right. But he got the vaccine, the logical, since you're studying philosophy, the philosophy term is post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Is after this, therefore because of this, right? So he got it, his left arm stopped working after he got the vaccine. Therefore, it must have been because of the vaccine. Right. Rather than, no, that may not be the case.
The old causation correlation.
Correct.
Well. Right. So I guess, a good way of framing the problem that's going to have to be answered in the months to come, right? Is having a clear understanding that whatever the vaccine, there's no vaccine that has no side effects. This is going to have some kind of side effect because it's a novel mRNA, kind of platform. It may have side effects that are hopefully actually not devastating.
That was the other thing I forgot to mention, is that actually there is another factor that occurred to me, is not only is the mRNA platform novel, right? But actually the spike protein itself is novel. That's not something that we've experimented with before, right? Even through another platform. So let's say a protein platform that we're very familiar with, right? Just hepatitis B, HPV. We've done this before. So we're comfortable with the platform, but the spike protein itself is novel. Mm-hmm. And it may have side effects that we are not anticipating. Right. So any aspect of novelty presents the potential for unforeseen consequences.
Yeah. Right. So I mean, it's that point is well made, that we are experimenting with a platform that we have no prior experience with before. So there is an unknowable kind of risk out there.
Correct.
Right. So the likelihood, and there's some likelihood that unknowable risk might present itself in the distant future, because we're dealing with, genetic manipulated, we're dealing almost with genetic manipulation. It's not quite genetic manipulation, but it's awfully close, right? It's in the same neighborhood.
That would be higher with the mRNA.
Yeah, it would be much higher, because you're not just giving the body an antigen to fight against, you're actually giving the body genetic instructions, like this is what you should be doing now. And so
we can debate, does reverse transcription happen from mRNA? But I can guarantee you there's no reverse transcription from protein to mRNA.
Right, exactly.
That's not a thing.
That's not a thing.
Right.
And so, they're just black box of like what could happen, and we both hope that the answer is nothing.
And by the way, I actually should say, I think nothing.
Yeah, right.
Right? If you're asking my opinion on what do I think is most probable, probably fine. Looks good. Data looks good. No sense of side effects, so on and so forth. But that's a flimsy basis on which to base huge potential problems, right? So in terms of not being alarmist, I think the data looks pretty darn good, right? And theoretically, there's no difference between Pfizer's mRNA or Moderna's mRNA and the virus's mRNA itself, right? This is how all viruses work.
There's a significant difference where the Pfizer mRNA is just a much smaller piece. It's just the spike.
Oh, sure. No, sorry. Yeah. The platform concept, right? That's how all viruses work. It's RNA, transcribed protein. We fight viruses all the time. This one's particularly, damaging, but we're only giving a part of it that we hope will be less damaging, right? But that concept of having mRNA introduced and then our bodies being used to make protein, that's the story of every virus.
Yeah.
Right? And so there isn't something particularly novel there, except that we just made this and are sort of introducing it, right?
Yeah.
So again, do I think there's going to be this reverse transcription into DNA and then all our children are going to come out glowing?
I think the only correct answer to that question is I don't know.
Correct.
You can't even say I don't think so. You could only say I don't know. I have no idea what.
We don't know about the super rare effects, right? Because we know up to 30,000 people.
Right. Yeah. So actually, we don't know about the
15.
late potential genetic side effects, right? So like 10 years later, do the people start glowing in the dark then? Is that when they start glowing in the dark? We have no idea because you're playing now with genetic material. And again, this is not an alarmist thing. This is just to demonstrate, this is just to carry over the point that we are dealing with a technology that we have had no actual experience with before. Yes, it's a vaccine, but it is brand new vaccine technology, right? And so it deserves to be placed in its own category of we are running an experiment here. And we hope, that it doesn't actually cause, some late stage untoward side effects. We're relatively confident that it's not causing any immediate side effects because we've tested it on tens of thousands of people. But at the end of the day, the answer is we really don't know what the side effects are going to be. Now, having said that, I think the best way to think about whether or not you're going to take a vaccine, because I think this is probably, if anyone's listening to this, what they want to get away from this. Is like, does
Sure.
this mean I should take the vaccine or not? Well, what is the answer? Tell me yes, no, give me direction. So the way
Sure.
that I will think about this, to answer the question for myself is perhaps, see, if you give 10 million, a billion doses of this vaccine, and then you wait 10 years, right? Just hypothetical, and nothing bad happens, and it's 95% efficacious. There's no long-term side effects after 10 years. There's no, whatever rare side effects are exceedingly rare, and they're all correctable. So that's the best case scenario, right?
Sure.
That is one extreme. And the other extreme is you've tested it on 10 people and they all seem to be doing fine, right? So that's the other extreme.
Sure.
Somewhere along the way, as you go towards that 10 million cases in 10 years or whatever, somewhere along the way, you're going to start to, as long as serious side effects don't develop, somewhere along the way, you're going to have to flip the switch and say, okay, I think it is now safe enough. I think we have enough data to say two things. Number one, that there don't appear to be any serious immediate side effects in the immediate few months. And then to some extent, I'm taking a chance on the long-term ones. I'm hoping that there's no long-term ones, but I need to move on with my life, right? And so I think that's the calculus that I will be making is like, okay, and I don't know what that number for me is. I don't know if I need to see data for 1 million people. I don't know if it's going to be good enough after 500,000 people. Do I need to see, data from 3 million people and I have to wait for 3 months to make sure there's no long-term side effects? But that's the sort of
that kind of gets into this issue, just what we were talking about the rotavirus vaccine, right? Is if you're 80 and overweight and diabetic and living in a nursing home, right? Well, if this coronavirus vaccine has any kind of risk that's less than 1 in 30,000, you're a net positive for taking the vaccine.
Yep.
Right.
So yeah, but what I was actually answering the question for myself,
for yourself,
as a relatively young person who doesn't live in a nursing home, this would, and hopefully have like 50 years of life ahead of me, that sort of, and also with the odds that I will probably be okay if I do get the coronavirus, so that there's some calculation made there as well. At some point in time, if a young person is, listening to this and wants to know, like, okay, at what point do I bite the bullet and say there's enough data to prove safety? Mm-hmm. And to some extent, that's subjective. You can't just do a yay or nay, right? You can't just say, well, after 2 million, it's, we're vaccinating everybody, right? Hide your kids, hide your wife, hide your sister. We're coming after everybody with vaccine jabs, right? It's based on everyone's sort of risk tolerance, right? At some point in time, if you're just a very, so I asked a question to a friend of mine recently. I'm like, well, we may not know, for example, we will definitely have more data in a year's time than we do today about this vaccine. Do you want to wait that long? Because do you want to wait that long? Because if the answer is no, the answer is yes, and I want 1 million, people to be vaccinated. I want 1 year's worth of data. Then what you're basically also saying is that you're going to continue to self-isolate if that's what you're doing. Hopefully that's what you're doing. You're continuing to self-isolate for that amount of time. And so that's the decision tree, you're faced with. Okay, I have, enough data for 100,000 people. That's good enough for me because I want to get back to normal life. I want to get on an airplane. I want to go see family. I haven't seen my parents in X amount of months, whatever. I want to do all of those things again. So I will take the risk after 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, whatever that number is for you.
The problem again there is that people are notoriously bad at estimating risk, right? And the effect of risk, right? Until after the fact. Right. So I think most people would say, 1 in 1,000 sounds pretty good. It's less than 1%. It's a tenth of 1%.
Yeah, that's very small.
And so that's what it seems like. But when it's presented numerically that way, right? But that's not how our intuition, like I said, the motorcycle example, we perceive motorcycle to be risky activity culturally. We have that understanding because that 1 in 1,000 number actually is something we should be worried about. Right. And it's not until if it's a 1 in 1,000 chance of, let's say, kidney failure or, dialysis dependent kidney failure. Well, that 1 in 1,000 people who ends up on dialysis will regret it incredibly deeply. Right. Right. And say, I should have waited and this and that. But that's how our minds work. And in fact, one of the actually, I thought about this, too. There's a great study in the sort of criminal justice arena that increasing penalties does not actually decrease the frequency of crime. What decreases frequency of crime is the likelihood of being caught, right? And so it's interesting is that like people, for whatever reason, on some level, if I say, oh, well, you could, die 1 in 1,000, or you could get a ration 1 in 1,000, somehow that we process that very similarly, right? That's wrong. We shouldn't process those similarly, but we do. And we need to account for the fact that people are not going to be making a rational analysis of what risk is acceptable, right? Because we have these weird tendencies in our brains to weight things. Similarly, like we don't, if I say we have 2,000 birds that are covered in oil from an oil spill, how much money are you willing to give, right? People are willing to give like $2 or something, right? But if I increase that from 2,000 to 200,000 and then to 2 million, and I sample different people, it goes up to like $4 instead of $2, right? We don't deal with multiplicative issues very well. We see that with climate change. We see that with all these things. Our minds, our emotions are not built for these numbers, right?
Or rather, our human intuitions.
Our intuitions, right?
Our heuristics.
And that's the problem of making it a subjective call. Is you're making it subjective on the basis. Well, I want to go do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I haven't done that because
but my argument is you have to make that call at some point.
Oh,
of the
yeah,
game,
yeah.
Right, and so.
But the question is, should we leave it to the public, or should we make that as a policy decision?
I think no. You have to leave it to the individual to decide if they're going to get the vaccine. I mean, you can't mandate vaccinations. You can't force.
We mandate vaccinations all the time.
You can't force adult people to get a vaccine. Especially a vaccine on a platform that's not proven. That's just not going to fly in any country in the world. I mean, people are going to say, well,
I'm sure China's already doing that.
yeah. Well, maybe that's one exception. No, but you can't mandate it, right? Because you can say that, and we talked about this, and in fact, this is probably a good time to segue into where the risk tolerance changes depending on your susceptibility to COVID, or susceptibility to dying of COVID, right? So if you are, like you said, an elderly person in a nursing home, you have diabetes and heart disease, you're 90 years old, you're not waiting for 1 million, people to get vaccinated and get the data from them. You're just getting that because the odds are overwhelmingly that the risk-benefit ratio works out in your favor. Yes, you could end up on dialysis because of it, but the odds are overwhelming that you are going to there's far more likely to benefit than not.
If you get COVID naturally, you could end up on dialysis because your kidneys at 90 aren't doing great anyway, right?
So in those kind of circumstances, your threshold to take the virus will require less information, right?
And that's actually, so again, let me dart sideways and then we'll come circling back. Like in my career, actually, and I've not been practicing that long. We had the option of oral polio vaccine, right? And it was taken off the market in the U.S., right? It's still available elsewhere in the world, and that's an interesting discussion because the oral polio vaccine is a live attenuated virus, and it does have a few cases, 1 in 2.4 million, I think.
Yeah.
But there are a few cases where it reverts to wild type spontaneously and causes polio and paralyzes children, right? So 1 in 2.4 million is a very rare side effect, right? The problem is that we haven't had a single case of polio in the Western Hemisphere since like 1979, right? So if you're a kid in the US, a 1 in 2.4 million chance of getting polio from a vaccine is actually far higher than your chance of getting polio without a vaccine.
Infinitely higher.
Infinitely higher, right?
So if you don't do anything, you're not going to get polio. You take this, you might get polio.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so that is a problem, is that, if you were just giving the oral vaccine or if there were no injectable vaccine as an option, well, you are actively harming or worsening this child's risk profile, right? And that's a tremendous problem because as a physician, that's not my job. My job is to improve the individual's risk. But as a society, if we stop vaccinating entirely, then we could end up with a generation where it just comes roaring back, right? And that's why elsewhere in the world, the oral vaccine is still available because it is easier to distribute, it's easier to take, and doesn't require trained personnel, right? You don't need anybody who can give an injection. It's just an oral dose. And so the risk 1 in 2.4 million is still considered low enough elsewhere that it's worth doing.
Yeah. Because in that case, the risk-benefit profile favors in that population giving the
correct.
vaccine.
And in that case, we're talking about geographic population. And in the case of coronavirus, we're talking about a population segmented by age. We're segmented by gender, segmented. It's an interesting thing. Actually, we can get super. How about we get super edgy here? Men are actually at significantly higher risk than women.
Oh, so don't give it to women?
Yeah, so don't give it to women, right? Only men should get the vaccine, or men should get it first, right? So you can take the thought process.
Just like the good old days.
Yeah. You can take this process you can take the thought process pretty far in troubling ways.
Yeah.
Right? Or ways that we would find troubling, right? And that's kind of an interesting thing is that, what is the difference between giving, and it will be rationed at first because we're not going to have 300 million doses. So we're going to have to make some decisions about who gets it first, right? So if we're giving it to 80-plus-year-olds with multiple medical conditions, well, why can't I get it? I want to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, why is the 80-year-old getting it, this and that? She's higher risk, okay, but there's going to come a time where it's like, well, who is...
And this is assuming that we give it to all these, 2-3 million 80 years old and no serious side effects emerge at a rate that makes it prohibitive to give it to the general population, right?
And actually, correct.
And again, to reemphasize the point that there's going to be a greater risk tolerance greater risk tolerance in the elderly population for side effects because the risk benefit of favors
because they're already at higher risk.
Yeah, they're the higher risk from getting coronavirus and dying. You just bring that risk down. Yes, maybe the risk of getting the virus still is of getting the vaccine side effects is there.
Sure.
But overall, that risk profile has gone down by what you've done. Now,
and then you can use that to measure what the real risk is, and then make decisions about the next layer.
Assuming that the side effects are the same in elderly versus the young.
Which again,
population.
you have a layer of uncertainty every time you make a switch.
Every time you do. So to continue the edgy conversation here, I've also posited this as well. Is it seems that children do the best of all cases. I'm telling you, yes, you have young athletes with myocarditis and chronic fatigue and all of this, but definitely there's very, very, very few cases of children dying. Are there some? Yes, there are, but
Correct.
By and large, they're much, much less. So let's say the chances of an adverse outcome in a child, whether that be chronic medical problems or death, is say X out of whatever.
It's actually,
right?
so in children, like less than 12, for instance, it's comparable to flu. So it's about 140, 150 deaths.
So not just deaths, but even chronic side effects. So
I don't know. I don't know the numbers.
Let us just,
Sure.
peg that rate of whatever bad things happening at, an X, right?
Sure.
And then you have, the potential unknowable, especially with mRNA, platforms, unknowable long-term side effects at some other rate, Sure. If you don't know what this rate is, right? The vaccine rates, but you do kind of know what these rates are, you have to make a very deliberate, conscious decision because you don't know what risk profile you're moving them into, right? And so, and in fact, you could argue that because the risk to kids is so low and you don't know what the risks of the vaccine are just yet, it's probably a good idea right now to just not give it to kids. Now, that is a highly controversial subject and open to massive misinterpretation because you have the whole, MMR causes autism, bullshit that's been going around for years now. And now, as a physician, I'm saying, I don't think you should give this vaccine to kids, so that's very, Sure. easy to misinterpret what I'm saying here, but it's all about risk profiles here, and it's only because we don't know the risk profile
Correct.
in this new platform, especially because it's genetic, near genetic material, and you're giving it to kids who have another 80, 90 years to go. You have no idea what's going to happen to those kids. So, the threshold, the risk tolerance for the vaccine should be much higher for kids than it should be for, say, a 90-year-old living in a nursing home, right? And they have to be treated as completely separate sort of risk profiles. And I think that's the central, that should be one of the central messages of our conversation is that we have to think about this in terms of relative risk. There's a risk of getting the coronavirus and the side effects of that, the risk of the vaccine. Some of those risks are unknown because we have a new platform. And then at some point in time, you have to make a decision about which is the lesser risk. And the more vaccine data comes out, the more we will know what that risk profile looks like. And right now we don't know.
And we don't know. And again, that even the point of knowledge even is not binary. It's not like at some point we'll know, right? What will happen, and a better way to put it is, right now we know that there probably are not major side effects in the first 3 months for
30,000.
rarer than 10, probably more like 10,000, if you should be able to tell the difference from chance, right? So it's probably, if there is any side effect, it's probably more rare than 1 in 10,000, right? Or it happens after 3 months. So as we give more doses, as we give more people, and as we experience a longer time frame, the bounds of our comfort and knowledge will expand. It'll never be, or not never, but it's going to be a long time before we really can say, yeah, we understand this pretty well, right? But it's not an on-off, oh, now we know it's safe. No, we don't. That moment is not going to come for a long, long time.
Yeah, we will slowly approach some clarity on the issue.
Right. It will be more, we'll say, okay, now we're comfortable that the risks are less than 1 in 10,000. Now less than 1 in 30,000. Now less than 1 in 50, 1 in 100.
And these are the risks.
For these, and these are the risks.